Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. The Crusades are an interesting topic that has been studied almost since the Crusades. However, most of the information that we read and watch is from a European perspective. This is not surprising because European sources are just much more plentiful and accessible than Islamic ones. However, there is indeed an Islamic perspective on the Crusades. For the Europeans, the Crusades were about capturing the Holy Land and establishing a Christian kingdom in the Muslim Middle East. For Muslims, it was an apocalyptic event, at least the First Crusade was. In the Muslim context, the Crusades were not just a battle for the Holy Land, but also a punishment from God for Muslim disunity and infighting that had been ongoing for a century between local lords, the Shia Fatimids, and the Sunni Seljuks. Some authors even viewed the First Crusade as another step in a collective Christian conquest of Islamic lands, which they perceived as a single united invasion where Toledo in Muslim Spain fell in 1085, the Emirate of Sicily fell in 1091, the Norman kings of Sicily made incursions against North Africa, and finally the Crusader army marched from Europe all the way to Jerusalem. However, as the number of crusades went up, the perceived threat in Muslim minds went down. Muslims didn't really take any crusades after the third one very seriously. In this video, I'll be presenting the Islamic perspective of the Crusades. This video is brought to you by, well, all of you. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel and making these videos possible. Al-Muqaddimah is funded only by Patreon, and as you can see, the videos take a long time to research, edit, and produce. It's only because of my patrons that I can put this kind of time into these videos and keep them free from any kind of paywall. So if you want to pledge $1 or more to support the channel, you can head over to my Patreon. The link is in the description. You can also become a member right here on YouTube. There are no benefits attached to it because I don't get the time to work on them. So if you want to support Al-Muqaddimah financially, please go ahead. Otherwise, just like, comment, share, and subscribe. That's also supporting Al-Muqaddimah. Before we start, let me clarify a few points. First, I'll be focusing on the Crusades in the Levant from 1095 CE, when Pope Urban II declared the First Crusade, to 1291 CE, when the city of Acre fell and the Crusader kingdoms in the Levant were wiped out. While many wars have been labeled as crusades, and this practice continues even into the 20th and 21st centuries, we will only discuss the medieval crusades aimed at capturing the Holy Land, despite some of them veering off to, sack Constantinople instead. Today, Muslims translate the English term crusaders as Salibiyun, which means the same thing as crusader. Both of them reflect the importance of the cross symbol during these conflicts. However, Salibiyun is a recent term. Historically, Muslims refer to the Crusaders as Farang or something similar, meaning Frank, as many of the initial Crusaders were indeed Franks. It is interesting to note that Farang is still used in parts of the East as Farangi or Farangi to refer to Europeans. In Pakistan, where I come from, it was used to denote the British during the colonial era. Throughout this video, I'll be using Franks and Crusaders interchangeably. Not all Franks were Crusaders, of course, and not all Crusaders were Franks, but still, I'm gonna go with this. Secondly, it's crucial to avoid oversimplifying these wars as religious conflicts. The situation was not a straightforward division between Muslims and Christians. As soon as the Crusaders arrived in the Middle East, rival Muslim factions saw them as potential allies against other Muslims. Christian lords ruling the Holy Land also occasionally sought alliances with Muslim rulers against other Christians. While it's true that cities changing hands often led to the expulsion or massacre of the former lords' co-religionists, it wasn't always a religious conflict. We'll delve deeper into these dynamics in a minute. Lastly, medieval Muslim sources approach history differently from modern perspectives. They viewed history as a moral study rather than a factual record. Many medieval Muslim chronicles of the Crusades, being religious scholars themselves, tended to interpret events through a religious lens, focusing on the moral implications of events rather than minute details such as battle strategies. Keeping up with this tradition, I too find detailed military discussions tedious, so we won't delve into battle specifics. With these points clarified, let's get started. Around the turn of the millennium, when we switch from BCE to CE, the Middle East was under Roman rule. The inhabitants gradually converted to Christianity following the Romans' conversion in the 4th century. By 500 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire had control over a largely Christian Middle East after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. The Arabian Peninsula, seen as a land of sand and renegades by the Romans, was situated south of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine border. The Romans had no interest in governing Arabia, seeking only to maintain control through fear or bribery. However, their efforts failed spectacularly in the 7th century. Prophet Muhammad was born around 571 CE and received the revelation of the Quran in 610 CE. By his death in 632 CE, the Muslim community he established had controlled most of the Arabian Peninsula. Meanwhile, the Greek Byzantines and the Persian Sassanid empires were battling for dominance over the Middle East. Their latest war lasted from 602 to 628 CE, during which the Persians went as far as Egypt and even Constantinople, the Byzantine capital. However, under the leadership of the Emperor Heraclius, the Byzantines pushed back the Persians and regained their territories in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. They also came within spitting distance of the Persian capital. By the end of the war in 628, both empires were exhausted. Many of their cities had changed hands. Some had been sacked multiple times over. Their men had died in the thousands and their coffers were empty. This extreme drain of all their resources, financial and human, left them vulnerable to the emerging threat from the Arabian Peninsula. After Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, his successor, Abu Bakr, assumed the leadership of the Muslim community. He and his successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, assembled an army and began raiding the Byzantine and the Sassanid empires, which escalated into a full-scale invasion. The Byzantines and the Sassanids, weakened and resource depleted, could not repel the Arab Muslims who were united and invigorated by their new religion. The Muslims defeated the Byzantine Empire and conquered Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. They also took Jerusalem in 637 and, recognizing its holy status, made an effort to preserve and enhance the city while keeping it open to all pilgrims. The Rashidun Caliphate, which succeeded Prophet Muhammad, was followed by the Umayyad Caliphate in 661 CE and then by the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 CE. During the reign of these three caliphates, the Holy Land remained firmly under their control and everyone was welcome to visit, pilgrims and merchants, Muslims and Jews and Christians alike. While this arrangement was mostly accepted by Christians in Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire, the status quo would change around the year 1100. Let's fast forward to the 11th century, roughly 100 years prior to the First Crusade, which began when Pope Urban II declared the First Crusade in 1095 at the Council of Clermont. Their famous battle cry was Deus Vult, meaning God wills it. If you lived in 1099 CE, when Jerusalem fell to the Franks, you might have indeed believed that God willed the Holy Land to be in Christian hands. Their timing was impeccable. It was the perfect moment to strike. It's a fascinating coincidence, as there's no evidence that anyone from the Muslim world advised them to attack at that time. The Islamic Middle East that the Crusaders would encounter was not a unified entity like early Islam under the Rashidun, the Umayyads, and the early Abbasids. It was a fragmented civilization with very little sense of unity. Dominant political and religious debates within the Islamic empires led to Muslim factions battling each other. Furthermore, in 1092, 1093, and 1094, the empires ruling the Middle East found themselves without leaders due to a series of assassinations and suspicious deaths. Let's examine them individually. The Abbasid Caliphate declined in the 9th century, and by the year 900, they had lost significant territories. In 950, they were so weak that the Buyids, a dynasty from northern Iran, conquered them. The Buyids were Shias, whereas the Abbasids were Sunnis. This meant that the Sunni Caliph, the effective head of Sunni Islam, was now a puppet of the Shia Buyids. This initiated the so-called Shia century, when Shias dominated much of the Middle East. However, the Seljuk Turks from Central Asia, recent converts to Islam who saw themselves as the faith's protectors, defeated the Buyids and took over the Abbasid Caliphate. In 969, the Fatimid Caliphate from modern-day Tunisia conquered Egypt. They then expanded into the Levant, taking Palestine and the Hijaz, home to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This brought them into conflict with the Abbasid Caliphate and their overlords, the Seljuks, due to their Shia faith. This conflict wasn't only about political power but also religious dominance. The eventual collapse of the Shia Fatimid Caliphate contributed significantly to the majority of Muslims today being Sunni. The conflict between the Abbasids and the Fatimids disrupted the flow of merchants and pilgrims to the Holy Land. The roads, which had been open to all members of all faiths since the Arab conquest of Palestine and Syria, became less safe. On top of that, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim also persecuted the Christians and destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 CE. This prompted European Christians to consider reconquering the Holy Land. Over the next century, the Seljuks and the Fatimids battled in the Middle East, with the Seljuks also extending north into present-day Azerbaijan, Armenia, and eastern Turkey. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Muslim Seljuk dynasty inflicted a significant blow to the Byzantine Empire, was the primary reason behind the First Crusade. This battle made the Seljuks realize that Anatolia, which previously was thought to be impregnable, was open to conquest. This forced the Byzantine emperor to seek help from Western Christians. The idea of retaking the Holy Land was already brewing among Christian leaders there, so it seemed like the right time to strike. By the final decade of the 11th century, the Middle Eastern empires were not in a bad shape. The Fatimid Caliphate was strong under Al-Mustansir's rule, and the Seljuk Empire was well managed by the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk and the Sultan Malik Shah. However, in 1092, Nizam al-Mulk died, followed by Malik Shah in 1094, and then Al-Mustansir. Later that year, Al-Mustansir's vizier died, and then Sunni Caliph Al-Muqtadi also died. One author referred to it as the year of the deaths of caliphs and commanders. The entire region, from Libya to India, was destabilized by these deaths, and much of the Middle East, especially the Holy Land, was ravaged by ongoing war between the Seljuks and the Fatimids. It was in these conditions that the Crusaders began preparing to invade. The First Crusade saw multiple armies leave Europe. For example, the People's Crusade was led by a preacher called Peter the Hermit and was made up of unarmed civilians who were defeated and destroyed by the Seljuks in 1096 in western Turkey. The only thing that they actually did in the crusade was massacre something like 10,000 or 20,000 Jews in Central Europe. The Seljuks that destroyed this army weren't exactly the same as the ones back in the Middle East. They were a junior branch of the family, but they were independent in all but name, and often in name too. They controlled a sizable portion of Anatolia. They were one of the biggest reasons behind the Byzantine emperor asking the Western Christians for help. They were only a stone's throw away from Constantinople, and they were harassing the Byzantines a lot. And they weren't the only Turkic entity there. Anyhow, the official Crusader army, if you can call it that, reached Constantinople in fall of 1096. At this point, Muslims were made aware of the army. It's unclear how, but Muslims knew that there was a large army gathered at Constantinople. There's an idea that the Byzantines and the Fatimids were allied or had some kind of an alliance in the works, but we don't know if that's true. Frankly, a lot of the later authors were Sunnis and they almost certainly had an anti-Shia bias, so this might just be propaganda. They also knew of the later tensions between the Byzantines and the Crusaders that saw their alliance crack. After arriving in Constantinople, the Crusaders marched on Nicaea, which was used as their capital by the Seljuks. This Seljuk Sultanate, by the way, was known as the Sultanate of Rum because Rum or Rome was the term Muslims used for this region of Asia. The Seljuk army was in the east, fighting a fellow Muslim Turkic army there. They rushed back to relieve the city, but they were defeated and pushed back by the united Crusader and Byzantine armies. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, however, didn't give up. A year later, he came back with an impressive army and ambushed the Crusaders, inflicting quite a bit of damage on them, including burning their supplies. While Kilij Arslan was defeated, the Crusaders weren't exactly the winners either, because now they had to starve as they marched on the Holy Land. The Crusaders first took Edessa, which was actually in Christian hands at the time. The army that took it wasn't the main Crusader army, but instead it was a smaller contingent under Baldwin I, later King of Jerusalem. Hence, Edessa became the capital of the County of Edessa, which was the first Crusader state to come into existence in the Middle East. However, the main event was coming in October 1097. When the Crusader army reached Antioch in 1097, they had been starving, but there were relief efforts from, for example, recently captured Edessa. It seems that while Muslims understood that the army was quite large, they also underestimated it and perhaps thought that it was merely an army of mercenaries hired by the Byzantines and would break at the first sight of real trouble. The governor of the city fortified it, but it fell on June 10th, 1098. An army from the Emir of Mosul was also defeated outside the walls of the city. The Crusaders found the Holy Lands in Antioch because a man named Peter Bartholomew had a dream and then started digging. That really invigorated the spirit of the Crusaders and pushed them forward, despite the fact that they were starving. In the same year, the Crusaders attacked the city of Ma'arat al-Numan. While the siege itself isn't all that important, it's famous for the fact that it's possible that the Crusaders had to resort to cannibalism to feed themselves. While there's no doubt that the Crusaders were starving for a number of reasons, some scholars doubt that the Crusaders, or at least a subgroup of them, actually resorted to cannibalism outside the walls of Ma'arat al-Numan. Anyhow, the Crusaders took that city and prepared to march on the original target of the crusade, the holy city of Jerusalem. The Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem on June 7th, 1099. The city was, at the time, under the control of the Fatimids, but that hadn't been the case for long. The Fatimids knew of the Crusaders' impending arrival, and so they had taken the city from the Seljuks in a rushed assault, while the Seljuks were busy elsewhere. The Fatimids tried to negotiate with the Crusaders, but to no avail. The Crusaders had their eye on the city and nothing less. Anyhow, after a siege of 5 weeks, the city fell to Christian hands, around 460 years after having been conquered by the Muslim Arabs in 637. What followed was a bloodbath. The city's Muslims and Jews were killed in the streets. The Muslim scholar Ibn al-Athir, who's a major source during this period, puts the figure at around 70,000, but it's possible that it was lower, maybe 50,000. It seems that there were no Christians in the city at the time because the Muslims had kicked them out earlier before the siege began due to their fear of collusion. In any case, the Crusaders had won the day. They had come from Western Europe through Constantinople, across the Anatolian plateau, into Syria, and then finally to Jerusalem. It was quite a feat, especially considering that the terrain was hostile to them, and they spent a lot of time starving. They closed off the crusade by trying to expand into Ascalon, the last major Muslim city in the region. Even though the Muslim army was double the size of the Crusaders, they were defeated in August 1099 in the Battle of Ascalon. This marked the end of the First Crusade. However, Ascalon would remain in Muslim hands for another 50 years. When the dust settled, there were 4 new Christian entities in the Middle East: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and finally the Kingdom of Jerusalem. A new status quo was established. The Shia Muslims in Egypt were now separated from the Sunnis in Iraq, Syria, and further east. A lot had changed between 1109 CE, when the city of Tripoli fell to the Christians, and 1144, when the city of Edessa fell to a man named Imaduddin Zengi. The Seljuk Empire had all but fallen. Its vassals were slowly walking away, some openly defiant, while others still paying lip service to the Sultan. The Crusader kingdoms shared border with 3 Muslim polities in 1140. To the south, of course, were the Fatimids, who had declined even further since the First Crusade but were managing to hang around due to a series of powerful viziers. However, the viziers were actually fighting each other, and it was said that the only way to become vizier was by killing the last one. To the east, there was the Emirate of Damascus, a fairly powerful emirate that had taken over after the death of the last Seljuk governor. Finally, to the north was the Zengid Emirate of Mosul. Mosul had previously been a powerful emirate as well, and their former ruler, Kerboga, was actually a hero of the First Crusade on the Islamic side because he had fought valiantly against the Crusaders, but he had been defeated in the Battle of Antioch. Now the Emirate of Mosul was under a brilliant general named Imad-ad-Din Zengi. By 1144, when Zengi showed up outside Edessa, he had secured much of eastern Syria and northern Iraq for himself and had proven himself to the Seljuk Sultan and the Abbasid Caliph. He had taken Aleppo and fought against the Crusaders. In short, the man was a great warrior and a hero of the Islamic world in the making, if not one already. In 1144, he secured his place in history by capturing Edessa. Edessa was the first of the Christian states established during the First Crusade, but it had also been the weakest throughout. Still, its fall shook the Franks, who feared that Zengi might now march on Antioch and eventually reach Jerusalem, driving the Christian crusaders into the sea. However, even if Zengid wanted to, or had the ability to, he didn't press on his advantage. He had to return to Mosul to deal with some political stuff there, where he was killed by a slave in 1146. Ironically, the slave was Frankish and, as the story goes, had been threatened with punishment for drinking out of the emir's cup. Imad-ad-Din was followed by his son Nur-ad-Din Zengi. However, his moves against Edessa had rung up all kinds of alarm bells in Christian Europe, which had triggered the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade was kind of like the second Indiana Jones movie. Kind of meh, but it leads to some interesting stuff. So the Second Crusade was the first to be led by actual European kings. The previous generation had been led by preachers, knights, and warriors, but no kings. However, this achievement didn't have much of an impact on the outcome of the crusade. They were marching into a much stronger Islamic Middle East than the First Crusade had. 2 armies arrived in the Middle East, but they were defeated by the Zengids under Nur-ad-Din Zengi. The Crusaders also tried to take Damascus in order to counter some of the Zengid power in the region, but were pushed back as well. None of that matters, to be honest, but what matters are the figures and events that the crusade was about to give birth to. This was actually the first crusade to actually expand out of the Middle East. The Pope sanctioned attacks by the Christians against Muslim Spain. At the time, the Almoravid dynasty, which ruled Morocco and southern Spain, was collapsing and the Christians were chipping away at their territory. So some crusaders did join the Spanish, attacking the Muslim cities. Among the cities that fell was Lisbon. The events between the Second and Third Crusade are some of the most fascinating, not only in the Crusades, but also in world history. Honestly, the events are so interesting that they should make a movie about them. I think the director of the recent Napoleon movie would be a great choice for that. Someone should get in touch with him. So let's start with Imad-ad-Din Zengi. During his rise to power, he had tried to take Baghdad but had been pushed back. His life was saved by a man named Ayub, who was a Kurdish governor, maybe of a small town or a couple of towns. Anyhow, Imad-ad-Din remembered this man and gave him a job. Ayub's brother was named Asad-ad-Din and became one of Zengi's most important generals. Asad-ad-Din eventually got the title of Shirekuh, hence his full title was Asad-ad-Din Shirekuh, meaning the Lion of the Faith, the Lion of the Mountain, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Shirekuh had a nephew, Ayub's son, who was named Yusuf ibn Ayub. After the Second Crusade, young Yusuf joined his uncle and became his protege. Together, the uncle and nephew went on many campaigns. Eventually, they invaded Fatimid Egypt. That in itself is a very fascinating story. So the Zengids, under their emir Nur-ad-Din Zengi, had been clashing with the Fatimids for a while, and the Fatimid vizier, Shawar, asked the king of Jerusalem, Amalric I, for help against fellow Muslim Zengids. This wasn't unusual for the time. By this point, the Crusaders were seen by the Muslims as just another entity in the Middle East that could help them or compete with them. Anyhow, to avoid Fatimid Egypt falling into Frankish hands, Shirkuh invaded and defeated the vizier and took over as the vizier of the Fatimids. So basically, he was the Sunni vizier who in theory served the Shia Fatimid Caliph, but in reality served the Sunni Zengids, but was himself powerful enough to challenge the Zengids. Shirkuh unfortunately died in 1169, only a few months after taking Egypt, and his nephew and protege, who by this point wasn't a significant figure, was installed as vizier. However, Shirkuh had trained him quite well, and Yusuf became very good at political games, becoming ruthless or extremely diplomatic, depending on the need of the time. When the last caliph of the Fatimids, Al-Adid, died in 1171, Yusuf declared the end of the Fatimid Caliphate. He then claimed to be ruling on behalf of Nuruddin Zengi, whom Yusuf seems to have respected, but it seemed that at the point the two were on a collision course as Yusuf's power increased and Nuruddin felt that he was a threat. Anyhow, they were spared from facing each other by Nuruddin's death in 1174. At that point, Yusuf ibn Ayyub declared himself Sultan of Egypt under the new title of Salahuddin Ayyubi, founding the Ayyubid dynasty. Salahuddin, or Saladin as the Crusaders called him, is the most popular and famous figure on the Islamic side of the Crusades. Salahuddin, like Nuruddin before him, saw the conquest of Edessa by Nuruddin's father as only the first step in pushing the Crusaders into the sea. He wanted to end their kingdoms and bring the Holy Land back under Muslim control. For those purposes, he defeated Nuruddin's successors in Iraq and Syria and united them under his Egyptian Sultanate. He then started harassing the Crusaders. In the years between 1174 and 1187, Salahuddin fought the Crusaders as well as made peace with them from time to time. One such peace came in 1182 CE, which seems to have angered one particular Crusader quite a bit. His name was Reynald of Chatillon. Reynald had actually arrived in the Middle East with the Second Crusade, but had chosen to stay behind. He was captured by the Zengids during a raid and spent 16 years in prison. Funny enough, he was released by the Zengids because Salahuddin was threatening the city of Aleppo, and the Zengids asked the Crusaders for help and released their prisoners in exchange for ransom. Because of this, Reynald hated Muslims with vigorous passion and even tried to raid the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. I have a video about that on my channel if you want to learn more about it. Anyhow, Reynald made any long-lasting peace quite difficult between Saladin and the Crusaders. When the Crusader king Baldwin IV died, his brother-in-law, Guy de Lusignan, became king there and went on the offensive against Salahuddin. Eventually, Salahuddin defeated him in the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where he executed Reynald as well. This opened the road to Jerusalem. Salahuddin besieged it and took it in the same year, 1187. This sparked the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade was a response to Salahuddin's conquest of Jerusalem. It began 2 years after that, though. Among the kings and emperors involved on the European side were Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, along with the nobility of the Crusader kingdoms, including Guy de Lusignan, Conrad of Montferrat, and Balin of Ibelin, the man who had defended Jerusalem against Salahuddin. On the Muslim side was, well, Salahuddin, the Sultan of Egypt. However, Salahuddin's stars had kind of turned by this point. The siege of Jerusalem was the peak of his power. Salahuddin wasn't able to win against the Crusaders. He faced 3 very major defeats. First, the Crusaders took Acre from him in 1191. Then they defeated him in the Battle of Arsuf in the same year. That one was particularly bad because Salahuddin seemed to have all the advantage before the battle. Then in 1192, he was defeated in the Battle of Jaffa, again a particularly bad defeat. However, a lot of this was Salahuddin's own making. He was too nice at times. After many battles and sieges, he let the Christian prisoners go and they went to defend the next town or join the next battle on the Christian side. The rest of this failure, however, was Richard the Lionheart's brilliance on the battlefield. This man was terrible at everything. He was a terrible king, terrible brother, terrible husband, terrible son, but by God, the man was an incredible general. Affairs back home, especially with the French, made Richard eager to leave the Holy Land, so he didn't press on his advantages and instead negotiated a peace treaty in 1192 that ended the Third Crusade. Both Salahuddin and the Crusaders ended up losing quite a bit and gaining quite little. The Crusaders secured their kingdom and slowed down Salahuddin's advance forward, but they couldn't take Jerusalem. The cost was simply too high for what it ultimately achieved. Similarly, Salahuddin wanted to push the Crusaders into the sea, but failed at that as well, and ultimately came out weaker on the other side. Salahuddin died in March of 1193. The Third Crusade made Egypt the main target in the minds of Europeans. Since Egypt was protecting Jerusalem, there was no way to take Jerusalem without seriously hindering Egypt's ability to defend it. So that's exactly what the Christians had in mind when the Fourth Crusade came around in 1204. So remember how I mentioned the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was a part of the Third Crusade? Well, that's only partly true, because Barbarossa died while crossing Anatolia, and his German army largely deserted the crusade and went back home. Now they were back under Barbarossa's son, Henry VII. They didn't do much, but they did take Beirut in Lebanon. The Ayyubids, after Salahuddin's death, were fighting each other and were eager to end any kind of invasion as quickly as possible. So they just made peace with the Crusaders and let them keep Beirut. The Fourth Crusade is, well, it's weird. The Crusades after the third one were kind of like the Indiana Jones movies after the third one. There's no point to them. They were a big dud, but people who made them still kept making them, hoping to recreate the success of the first one. For the Muslim world, they were mostly just a nuisance that got in the way of them doing things they really needed to get to. Luckily, as far as the Muslim Middle East was concerned, the Fourth Crusade never happened. The Crusaders wanted to invade Egypt and to make sure that it wouldn't be able to defend the Holy Land before they attacked it. And for that, they needed a navy. At the time, there was only one place in Europe that could outfit such a huge navy: Venice. The Doge of Venice was contracted to transport around 33,000 Crusaders to Egypt, with 1 year given to them to complete this contract. However, as the army began to arrive in Venice, they found out that they didn't have the funds to pay Venice back. Venice wouldn't let them leave without paying, so they had to arrange other transport or come up with the money. They were reached out by a Byzantine pretender to the throne named Alexios, who offered to pay off their contract and even give them more money if they helped him take Constantinople. The Crusader army, which had left their homes to take Egypt and then march on Jerusalem, was now headed to Constantinople, the most important Christian city. The importance of Constantinople in the Christian world can't be overstated. It was the biggest city in all of Christendom and the center of Eastern Orthodoxy. It was also a big commercial hub, and goods from all over Asia and Europe arrived there to be transported. This last reason is exactly why Venice was kind of excited to attack Constantinople. If they helped install the new emperor, they'd be able to get all kinds of trade concessions from him and boost their infant commercial empire. So, well, the Crusaders ended up outside the walls of Constantinople, a great fellow Christian city of around 500,000 people. In 1203, the Crusaders laid siege to the city and captured it, putting Alexios IV on the throne. However, Alexios wasn't able to pay them back because, of course, he couldn't. He had just come to power with the help of a foreign army, and he didn't have many friends in Constantinople. Long story short, the Crusaders ended up sacking the city in 1204. Let me say that again. The Crusaders, who had intended to capture Jerusalem from the Muslims, ended up sacking the greatest city in all of Christendom. Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire since the 4th century, would never recover from this. Its population declined greatly. The Crusaders formed an empire there and took over as the Latin Empire, which is not a contemporary term, it's a later invention. The Greeks called their rule Francokratia, or rule of the Franks. Anyhow, the Muslim world was largely unbothered by this crusade. The Ayyubids were busy fighting each other, so they were just glad to have gotten some breathing room for the next crusade. Pope Innocent III had called for the Fourth Crusade, but after its huge disappointment, he was eager to renew a call for the crusade to attack Egypt and then move on Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had just come under the control of John of Brienne, who was the father of the reigning queen, Isabella II. Isabella II was literally a baby and John was a regent. The Franks saw that the ruler of Egypt, Al-Adil, was quite old and could die at any moment, which would open the Ayyubids up for attacks. So anyhow, a Crusader navy arrived in Egypt and besieged the harbor of Damietta in 1218. Al-Adil was away in Syria at the time and had tasked his sons with defending Egypt. The Egyptian army was unable to push the Crusaders back and break their siege, but they were successful in containing the Crusaders to make sure that they couldn't attack further inland. John of Brienne left Egypt in 1220 to press his claim on the Kingdom of Cilicia, as his father-in-law, the King of Cilicia, had just died. This weakened the leadership of the Crusaders in Egypt, as the de facto leader of the Crusaders wasn't a military general. It was a cardinal named Pelagio Galvani. He was unable to get his army to move and attack further in until John returned at the behest of the Pope. With John not in Egypt and the army getting stale in Damietta, the Egyptians were able to prop up the small camp of Mansoura a bit inland from Damietta to stop any Crusader advances, which they did. Pelagio didn't have the military knowledge for such an operation against such a large army, and he wouldn't listen to any of the more senior commanders. As you'd expect, it resulted in a disaster. The Egyptians simply were better prepared and had better knowledge of the terrain. In the negotiations, the Crusaders offered to leave Damietta in exchange for the true cross, the cross that Jesus was said to have been crucified on. That cross was taken from the Christians by Salahuddin after he defeated them at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. However, the cross was then sent to the Caliph in Baghdad, but as it turns out, the Caliph had somehow lost it. It seems shady, but yeah, the Crusaders returned home empty-handed. Now, the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Adil, the brother of Salahuddin, had died in 1218 during the Fifth Crusade. His sons stayed united to fight the Crusaders, but as soon as the crusade was over, the brothers were at each other's throats. So you can imagine how unwelcome the news of a new crusade was to them. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, was open to talking with the Egyptians rather than fighting, as long as it got him what he wanted: Jerusalem. Anyhow, the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, offered him Jerusalem in exchange for military help against his own brothers. Al-Kamil invited Frederick to the Holy Land for negotiations, and to avoid a conflict, he signed the Treaty of Jaffa in 1229. It was quite a secret treaty, but it gave Al-Kamil 10 years of truce to make sure that he could pay attention to what mattered to him, his throne, while Frederick got Jerusalem. In the end, there was very little fighting, but neither Christians nor Muslims were happy with this. Muslims were, of course, livid that Al-Kamil just handed Jerusalem to the Christians, while the Christians were unhappy that there was no fighting involved and it was done through secret backroom negotiations. So, less than 50 years after Salahuddin had conquered it, Jerusalem was back in Christian hands. The next Crusades, from an Islamic perspective, were not quite separate. What I mean by that is that, unlike the First and the Second, or the Second and the Third Crusades, there was not much of a break in between, at least from an Islamic perspective. The following decades represented a continuous struggle by the Egyptians to push back their enemies. However, the Crusaders weren't the only major enemy at the scene now. During the Fifth Crusade, an enemy attacked the Islamic East, specifically Central Asia and Persia. This enemy was the Mongol Emperor Genghis or Genghis Khan. The Mongols had invaded the Khwarezmian dynasty, which ruled much of the land in Central Asia and Persia. The invasion began because the Khwarezmian Shah had killed Genghis Khan's merchants, thinking that they were spies. However, after they were done destroying the Khwarezmians, they kept marching east. The Khwarezmians were pushed, so a part of their army ended up in Palestine and took Jerusalem from the Christians, putting Jerusalem back in Muslim hands. They ended up sacking Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, in 1244. Very Fourth Crusade behavior, if you ask me. A majority of their victims were Christians and Christian sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The situation was so complicated that the Khwarezmian army was allied with the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt and went to war against the Ayyubids in Damascus, who were allied with the Christians. They met at the Battle of Forbi, which greatly damaged Christian power in the Holy Land. See, the Ayyubids, true to form, were fighting with each other once again. Anyhow, this prompted the Seventh Crusade. This was the third crusade to hit the Middle East while the Ayyubids were fighting each other, but it was one of the more interesting crusades, even if some of the events were a bit of a rehash of the Fifth Crusade. You know, reboots and remakes, everything is a reboot or remake these days. Now, the Sultan of Egypt was a man named As-Salih Ayyub, who was in Syria at the time fighting his own kinsman, specifically his uncle, to unite both Egypt and Syria when the Crusaders arrived in Egypt, once again attacking Damietta. He sent his vizier to lead the defensive efforts there. Damietta fell to the Crusaders and As-Salih offered to give them Jerusalem to end the war right there. However, this time, the Crusaders weren't led by pragmatists like the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who accepted As-Salih's father's deal back in 1229. This time, the Crusaders were led by King Louis IX of France, also known as Saint Louis. He simply refused to negotiate with the infidel Ayyubids and pushed forward. Once again, the Egyptians and the Crusaders met at Mansoura. This time, however, the Crusaders carried the day and won, pushing the Muslims back, but at great costs. Louis realized that he would have to fall back and not push forward as his army was depleted. Unfortunately for him, the Egyptians realized the same thing. As Louis retreated, the Egyptians followed him and destroyed his army in April 1250. At this point, Louis agreed to negotiate, but, well, the Muslims refused. Actually, we have the color footage of the response by the Egyptian army.
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
Louis and most of his army was captured and taken to Mansoura. The number of prisoners were so high that the Egyptians couldn't guard them all, so they began executing them. The Christians started negotiations for ransoming King Louis, but at the time, the Ayyubids in Egypt were caught in their own struggle. As-Salih Ayyub had died in 1249 and his son, Turanshah, was the effective Sultan of Egypt after him. However, Turanshah's stepmother, As-Salih's wife, Shajar-ud-Dur, had other plans. A large part of the Egyptian army was made up of Turkic slave soldiers known as the Mamluks, who exercised a lot of power. They had hoped to secure power after As-Salih died, but Turanshah was quite strong as he had displayed his power against the Crusaders. Plus, Shajar-ud-Dur was afraid of him pushing her aside, and so they plotted to have him killed, which they did on May 2nd, 1250. According to one story, when the negotiators for the Crusaders arrived to agree on a ransom, they were met by Mamluks who had just killed the Sultan and even had his blood on their clothes at the time. Shajar-ud-Dur became the next Sultan of Egypt. Sultan, not Sultana. However, she was just a transitory sultan as she ruled for only 2 months and handed power to her new husband, Izz-ad-Din Aybak, the next Sultan of Egypt, a Mamluk. With the negotiations for Louis's release, the Seventh Crusade had effectively ended. Louis did try to work up an alliance with the Mongols, but he failed in doing any such thing and had to return home in 1254. He then tried his hand at another crusade, this time against Tunis in northern Africa, but failed there too. He ended up dying there. Back in the Middle East, the Mamluks were securing power in Egypt, while the Mongols were destroying everything in sight, from the borders of India, which they were pushed back from, to the borders of Egypt. They sacked Baghdad in 1258, which sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. However, as they reached the peak of their conquests, they were defeated in Palestine at a site called Ain Jalut by Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan. The thing about the Mamluks was that when they fought each other, they weren't princes fighting for control. Rather, they were generals fighting for control, and so the one that ended up on the throne was usually the best among them all, with a bit of luck on his side. This kept the Mamluks militarily strong for a long time and meant that the Crusaders' days in the Holy Land were numbered. Baybars immediately moved to deal with the Mongol threat and faced the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260. He also gave refuge to the Abbasid caliphs who had been kicked out of Baghdad. This made the Mamluks the protectors of Islam in the eyes of many, and keeping up with that image, the Mamluks went on the offensive against the Franks. Part of the reason behind this offensive was that the Christians throughout Europe and the Middle East had allied with the Mongols. The Franks formed multiple alliances with them and joined them against the Mamluks. However, the Mongols themselves faced succession crises after 1260 and got busy fighting each other, so they couldn't help the Christians in as meaningful a way as the Christians had hoped for. The closest they came was during the Ninth Crusade, also known as Lord Edward's Crusade, when the English Prince Edward, who would later become King Edward I, went crusading. At that time, the Mongols gave him 10,000 men, but still he wasn't able to achieve much other than a truce with Baybars in 1272 for 10 years. By this time, Baybars had been scoring victory after victory against the Franks. He had even taken Antioch in 1268 and Querach de Chevalier in 1271. The fall of Antioch marked the second of the 4 original Crusader states established during the First Crusade. To recap, 4 states were established at Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. Edessa fell to the Zengids in 1144, and the next state was Antioch 127 years later. The ones left standing were Tripoli and the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Baybars died in 1277, and after his son's reign of 2 years, he was replaced by another general named Qalavun al-Salihi. Over the next decade, Qalavun both negotiated with and fought against the Crusaders. He chipped away at their small territory until 1289, when he took Tripoli itself, ending the 3rd state of the Crusaders. Tripoli had actually been a nominal vassal of the Mongols since 1260, but the Mongols had been busy elsewhere and couldn't protect it. Qalavun destroyed Tripoli, a city that had been in Christian hands for 180 years, and rebuilt a new Tripoli a bit inland. Qalavun died in 1290, and his son and successor, Khalil ibn Qalavun, brought the Frankish Crusader states to an end in 1291, when he took the city of Acre. Interesting story about that. According to at least one source, it seems that a Christian woman and a Muslim man had some sort of a romantic tryst in the city, which was discovered by her husband, who then apparently killed them both, either alone or with help. In any case, it led to increased tensions between the city's Muslims and Christians and led to city-wide violence where, according to one author, every Muslim in the city was massacred. This prompted Qalavun to march on the city, demanding the heads of the Christians who had conducted the massacre of the Muslims. However, Qalavun died before he could actually take the city, which was taken by his son Khalil. This marked the end of the Crusades in the Levant, as no major cities remained in Christian hands in the Middle East. There were still some Christian possessions here and there, but they too were taken soon after. The Crusades saw some 6-7 generations of Muslims and Christians fighting for the Holy Land in a series of wars that ultimately proved pointless. Assuming that the First Crusade was actually triggered because of the disruptions caused by the fighting Seljuks and Fatimids to the pilgrims and merchant routes from Europe to the Holy Land, can we say that the First Crusade managed to change that? For the first 50 years, yeah, sure, but then the war between the Muslims and the Christians began to intensify, and cities began changing hands again, becoming less safe for pilgrims and merchants. On the other hand, if we say that the First Crusade was triggered in response to the Seljuk Turks defeating the Byzantine Empire in 1071 and breaking into and taking over much of Anatolia, did the Crusaders manage to push them back? Not even a little bit. The Turks kept expanding. Not to mention, the Fourth Crusade directly resulted in the sack of Constantinople, a blow from which the Byzantine Empire would never recover. If the Crusades had never happened, eventually things could have turned out better in some respects. Constantinople could have been stronger, and maybe it could have repelled the Turks. The Muslims in the Middle East had no problems with Christian pilgrims coming to the city, so after things dialed down between the Seljuks and the Fatimids, the Holy Land would have been safe once again. However, the Crusades were responsible for many things. They led to cultural and technological exchange between the Islamic world and Europe. They also led to the lasting impression of Christians in the Muslim minds and Muslims in the Christian minds, which, to be honest, still exist today. Whether we know it or not, a lot of how the Islamic world is perceived in the West is still colored by the shadow of the literature of the Crusades. So in many ways, the Crusades left an indelible mark on world history that continues to exist on this day. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.